and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Well, welcome everyone to this special interview, which I am now conducting with the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Giffone, or Benj, as he is often called to his friends. Now, Benj is a pastor and Old Testament scholar and indeed author. And he's the author of this very, very important new book, which I'm going to hold up now, A House Divided, Technology, Worship and Healing the Church After COVID. Now, Benj, I have to say, you were very kind in getting me to read this book and endorse it before it came out. So I've been working from this stack of papers here for a while, reading this book, but I got this package from Amazon, and I thought to myself, oh, that must be something my wife has ordered, and I left it on the side for several days. But then I opened it last night, and it was filled with these books. So I was delighted to receive that, and I think we're going to have to do some kind of reading group or something in my church now. But thank you for sending them along. They look fantastic, and congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining me today. Do you want to just introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Jamie, thanks so much for having me on. And I just want to say I've been a fan and a listener of Irreverent from, I think from roughly the beginning. I don't remember exactly when I first discovered your work, your blog. I think I saw an interview with you in the early stages of the pandemic that was on maybe Unheard or something like that. So, and then you and I connected and have just been emailing here and there since then. So, but this is really great, and so this is kind of like a minor life dream come true to be on Irreverent. So thank you.
Far too kind. Far too kind.
My situation is that I'm an ordained minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. I was a missionary previously. My family, we were missionaries in Eastern Europe for 8 years. That'll be part of our conversation, I'm sure, today. And what I'm currently doing is I am currently serving as a transitional pastor in a church that is seeking renewal. And it's a church that's a little bit further away from where my family lives in Western Pennsylvania. And so we, for a variety of reasons, also worship together at a local Anglican church. Oh. And so that's a bit of an Anglican connection there. And the pastor of this church, the rector, is the one who did the art for the cover of this book. Okay. So Reverend Ethan Magnus is the rector at the church.
Yeah.
And I also wear a couple of other hats that I have recently joined our denomination's denominational mission. And so the role that I have as a scholar and a professor is to be involved in global theological education, so far mostly in Asia. So I go periodically to South and Southeast Asia and teach for a seminary, and also do local non-formal theological education, mostly among what we do is we work with pastors that are pastors, maybe the first Christians in their village in rural areas. And so they have a lot of zeal and they love Jesus, but they don't have very much knowledge of the Bible or theological training. And going to a seminary is not feasible for them. But we work with national partners in these countries to do short-term trainings that hopefully will equip these leaders to set these fledgling churches on the right path. And so I'm very excited to be. So I'm kind of between both of these ministries, being a transitional pastor and a missionary, but hopefully within the next year, I'll be fully engaged in that missions work, which involves teaching and writing as well, because I supervise graduate students for the seminary. And so keeping up to date with Old Testament research is part of what I do. So,
yeah. Well, it sounds like you have a very full life, Benj, and it's great that you've written this book, A House Divided. I think it's really the kind of book that the church needs. I don't know of another book like it, and indeed, as you know, there weren't at the time, in 2020, there weren't very many skeptical voices, if that's the right thing to call them, coming from the church about the narrative, the COVID narrative. Um, and you obviously had your doubts right at the beginning. As you just said, we connected via the podcast, and have been in touch since then. But those voices were quite few and far between, and indeed, that's one of the issues that you address in your book. As to some of why that is. But I think you've done the church a really good service with this book, and as I say, I've read it, I've endorsed it. I think it's a brilliant book, and I think it's what's badly needed. I think church leaders need to read this book and to take it seriously, and I hope many people do. So, congratulations on having it published. Why don't you start from that time in 2020? You were in Lithuania at the time. That's correct, isn't it, with your
Mhm.
family? So how did this whole journey towards writing this book start for you? Where did it come from, and what was going on around that time for you?
Yeah, it was a very, very challenging time, to say the least, for all of us. And yet, there were ways in which it felt both less challenging for us given our situation and also more challenging than what others were going through. And I'll explain what I mean by that. That in a sense, because what we were doing, the ministry that I had was missional university teaching and research, there were ways in which the work that I was doing was not that it was unchanged when everything went online, but that I was able, our we were supported as missionaries. Our income was not in danger at all. In some ways, it was kind of nice to have my kids home with us, and we could play games at lunchtime and have lunch together as a family. And in terms of my research, that's what felt the most normal to me because that's a solitary activity anyway, right?
Hmm.
But in terms of obviously having the kind of missional impact that we were hoping to have in our relationships with students and conversations before and after class, and just the stimulating conversation of being in a university setting, that was obviously cut off, and everybody was just kind of in desperation mode. And I would say more so with the church that one of the things that happened was that when you live cross-culturally, especially in a place where you do not know the language very well, and my wife and I never really became anywhere close to fluent in Lithuanian. You rely very heavily on your expat community for fellowship and friendship and spiritual discipleship, mutual encouragement and discipleship. And we were cut off from that. Now our church, we can talk about, our church reopened, our church, navigated the different difficulties with COVID. But for a time, when everything was online, in those first few weeks, many of us who lived cross-culturally as missionaries were cut off from our friends locally that we needed. And then at the same time, we were also exposed because we could go online and have conversations and even participate in quote unquote church with our supporting churches and our home churches back in the United States and Canada. There was sort of this looking back to Egypt and a reminder of how wonderful and refreshing church had been for us in the United States, and also how difficult and challenging it is to be the church and to do church and build relationships in a cross-cultural environment. So it was both. It was sort of a false sense of refreshment in terms of
Mhm.
those renewed relationships, which were not really church relationships. And I think that certainly things, we could talk in more detail, and much has been written about the different approaches to COVID in different countries, and Lithuania being a small country, tried to, they closed their borders very quickly. And there's sort of, because they're more recent into the EU, it was possible for them to kind of shut down borders in the way that it wasn't possible in the US between states. And so actually the summer of 2020 was fairly free and open. We participated in like our church's children's camps and youth camps. My wife and I went and led the music, and our kids participated. And, other than temperature checks, there really weren't any restrictions because the borders were sealed.
Mm.
But then it was when in the fall, when we started going back to school, and then the weather started to turn, that's when the cases started to rise, and then we started to see more aggressive lockdowns.
Mm.
And so that's when then the conflict started to come into play with the ways that our church and our Christian university and my colleagues had to be thinking about how do we respond to this to these government requirements, and to the real dangers for some people. What approach were we going to take?
Mm.
So
Yeah. And so, I mean, a big part of the book, the whole first part of the book really is about that issue of online church and the relationship between technology and the church. And I think it's fair to say that you have a critique there of the sort of uncritical acceptance of, online church and a sort of full embrace of it, as we certainly saw it here in Britain, certainly in the Church of England and elsewhere as well. Sounds like you had much experience of the same kind of thing. So, in your book, I mean, one of the principal arguments you make in that section is that online church can only deliver it can only deliver the means of grace in a partial way. I think you say, so you can have preaching via online church. You can have I forget what you name two that you can have, and then two that you can't have. The other ones you can,
prayer and singing,
yeah,
so those
prayer
have
and
got to
singing,
kind of go
yeah,
together. Yeah. But
yeah,
the,
and
the
then
fellowship of the
yeah,
saints and the sacraments are
yeah,
not
yeah.
something that can be really
So
done.
you can't have that stuff. So had you been thinking about that kind of thing before, or was it in this context that you started thinking about that sort of thing?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you bring that up, because it was something that I had been thinking a lot about, and also published an article on prior to COVID, about the structures, the kind of in this media ecology way of thinking about worship. It's how do the structures that we use, that we utilize, contribute to the meaning of what we're doing,
Yeah.
right? And so kind of starting with with different biblical topics, including Old Testament worship and New Testament worship, and then moving into the modern period. I had a sort of an article that covered some of this, but it's something that I have been thinking about as having been a church musician from a young age, and then seeing, coming of age in this internet age, and even um, when I was in college and helping out with the music and some of the ministry at the very large church that my late father-in-law was the music pastor for. There was a time where they had in this large building two separate auditoriums, a larger one and a small one, where there was two different styles of worship, but then the sermon was simulcast on one or the other of these stages on a screen. And so they had to sync this up, because there was a lot of producers involved, a lot of technology involved. But this was in 2005 or six
Mm.
already. And of course, many American churches have already switched to, prior to the pandemic, a multi-site model, where there's one kind of big name preacher who may in fact be an excellent preacher, not always sure about that or by what standards one would use, but certainly someone that people would really enjoy listening to and benefit from. And then, but then the ministry is done locally, maybe across multiple sites in an area or in a large city. That to me is a sort of a technologization of these communicative, this verbal communication with words. And you can also do that with the band as well, or the whatever sort of music you have at your church. That can be replicated via technology in multiple locations, but then at the expense of the direct contact with people, the relationships that are built, and of course the administration of the sacraments, which has been, being in the Reformed tradition, you being in the Anglican tradition, we have a view of the sacraments that's more than just a symbolic or memorial view.
Mm.
And yet, I think many, many people, even many who are in an ostensibly sacramental tradition or church, kind of reduced the sacraments to a simply symbolic view even before the pandemic, and then when everything went online, they were like, "Oh, it's just as fine. It's just as beneficial to do communion remotely." And even one of the Anglican scholar, I think bishops, Richard Burridge, wrote a book that I cite in my book that kind of explaining how online communion is just fine,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
so it's kind of and yet what was interesting was conversely in Lithuania, the church that we attended is in the Anabaptist tradition, and so has on paper a memorial view of the Lord's Supper, and yet after we did remote communion one Sunday, the first Sunday of April, after lockdowns, everybody was like, "No,
Mm.
this is not appropriate. This is not right. This doesn't feel
Mm.
right. We're
Mm.
going to wait till we can be back together to celebrate communion."
Yeah.
So even in that context where there was the doctrine on paper said that this could be fine, there was a more of a deep sacramental sense that we need to do this is something that needs to be done together when Christ can really be present with us when we celebrate.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, there's a sort of, to put it crudely, a sort of low high church thing where, sort of, and again, this might be slightly crude, but, the higher you go up, the more, at least ostensibly, the more of an issue it is, and the lower you go down in terms of, say, for example, just thinking that the sacraments are purely a symbol or a memorial, say, the Holy Communion is simply a memorial of Christ's crucifixion, say. Ostensibly, it sort of seems like it would be more possible to put those things online, as it were. But I don't think either of us would be particularly comfortable with saying that in any church context. Um, it seems to me that there's a problem with it, regardless of what you think about the sacraments. There's something about trying to replicate church online, which seems misguided and wrong. And I think a lot of people have that instinct, but they find it hard to put their finger on it. So I remember Justin Welby. I mean, he made a series of these really dispiriting videos during this time, and one of the things he said is, that Jesus is present to us when we meet online, and in a sense, you sort of think, well. Yeah, I suppose in a sense that's true. We could pray together. We prayed together before this podcast started, and that's a valid prayer, and we did that together. And you'd think, where two or three are gathered in my name, sort of applies even in this context when we're doing something online. But it doesn't seem quite right to go the whole way and to say, and therefore we can simply sort of transplant church onto an online platform like Zoom or something like that. So, I mean, what what's the sort of is there something you'd like to say about that in a kind of holistic sense, if that makes sense? What's the problem with, there's obviously specific theological problems you can point out with the sacraments, and you can't like physically be in the same building, but doesn't it sort of turn us into sort of online consumers, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it even gets to this bigger problem that we, and this relates to some things that you've written about this sort of this more general problem in Western society that we've sort of slid into a form of Gnosticism that
Mm,
says that, uh, well, and this manifestation of it is that, well, I am my brain and my soul, maybe if you're religious, but then I have a body,
yeah.
right? And my brain, my consciousness, and my knowledge can possibly be uploaded into something else. Now, maybe people would balk at that, to be uploaded into a cloud. And yet we almost live that way if we believe that we could have adequate worship or fellowship as a church simply by the exchange of words and communication. But I think you could look at it more in terms of this broader error of Gnosticism that has sort of renewed itself in modernity and has come into the church in these very destructive ways. But I think you can also just look at it at a very tangible level that um, what I had the chance to serve to visit people in their homes during COVID, people who are homebound. And as a pastor, I do that. And I was also a hospice chaplain, served as a hospice chaplain in the last couple of years. And there are people who are made in God's image who cannot communicate with you verbally, or who you might communicate with them and they might understand, but then they might not remember you the next time. So what is the value of this person? Well, they are made in God's image. They're a real human being. And so the way that I show love to them and receive love from them might be by reading some scripture to them or praying with them, but more often it's things like holding their hand while I sing to them, putting a comforting hand on their shoulder, looking them in the eye, and telling them that God loves them and that Jesus died for them, and that if they trust in him, they're going to be with him for eternity. Those are things that you can't do remotely. And I fear that, and this gets to some of the bigger questions. You can tell from reading the book that I'm very much a structures kind of person. How do these structures contribute? I think that for those of us who are even in the church, who are in the more intellectual class or elites, you and I are both church leaders and have advanced degrees. We tend to intellectualize and verbalize our experience of church, and we then extrapolate that to everyone, and to say that, well, you should be able to sit down and engage in church remotely because we're all just sitting down having intellectual conversation like you and I would be if we were sitting in your office,
Mm.
sharing a coffee. But that's not how many people, or even most people, live their lives and give and receive love. And it's not the kind of love it isn't the entirety of the kind of love and means of grace that they need to receive through the church. They need this holistic, the holistic ministry of Christ through the church.
Yeah, that's
So
really interesting. That's not actually occurred to me. So, I mean, you're kind of saying that in many ways, and this kind of gets into what I'd like to talk about next. In many ways, the response of the church hierarchy, as it were, was a sort of overly intellectualized response, which didn't take into account the embodied nature of the ministry of the church, which is it's an interesting take on it, and a thoroughly compelling one. Because one of the
in
things
in,
I
in
go on,
hmm?
you go on,
I was going to say, in a sense, we became, the church is led by the laptop class
Mm,
version of the Christian church, or the laptop class within the Christian church. And
mm,
so, just as in broader society, we saw this response of the laptop class that presumed that we could continue doing what we normally do remotely and didn't need to be embodied in person. There was, I think, a similar response in among the laptop class in the church.
yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's very interesting. So let's carry on with this then. How else would you characterize, broadly speaking, the response of the church's leadership at that time in 2020 and onwards to COVID? How did you see it then, and how do you see it now?
Do you mean our church in Lithuania or the church more broadly?
I mean, like the church more broadly, and the kind of
Mhm.
critique that this is bringing in your book here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and I kind of tried to describe the spectrum of approaches here. There were some people that were very much like, we're going to do it exactly the same way we always have, no change.
Yeah.
And there were people who said, we're going to go online and completely shift our services and our ministry to remote. A lot of that had to do with the geographic location of the church, the size of the church. There's so many different factors, right?
Mm,
And so the approaches were as many as there were churches. I did notice some themes in that there was not, as we've discussed, there was not really a correlation between the church's stated views about the sacraments
mm,
in terms of their significance for the necessity of embodied worship in the church, and how vociferously that church, or emphatically that church, or that leadership wanted to return to in-person worship. There were there was not really a correlation in that regard. I think that there was probably an inverse correlation between the the intellect, or a correlation between how intellectual the tradition is in generally speaking, and how long they were, how much more they were interested in um, believing or trusting in the elites of government and in public health. And there was probably an urban versus rural correlation there as well, that churches that were in the city and tended to have more um, upper class or richer people, highly educated people, were more likely to see the church, to be comfortable with the church closed for a long period of time. And as I outline later in the book, seemed more likely to be interested in measures that involved segregation, either on the basis of masks or vaccination.
Mm.
And so that to me indicates that there's something about, I think chapter 15 is really about this in the book, the respectability
Mm.
anxieties of many in our Christian elite circles about being accepted and being respected and applauded
Mm.
in the circles of non-Christian elites, especially in our fields of study or professional fields.
Mm.
And you continue to see this to this day. That, I mean, even a there was an article recently published in the denominational magazine of a close sister denomination here in the U.S., the Presbyterian denomination. It's similarly theologically conservative, that was written by a pastor who's also a medical doctor, who was basically saying, well, 5 years later, the lesson that we learned from COVID is that people were very selfish and they wanted to do their do their thing and to worship, and they didn't pay attention to they didn't respect medical and public health authorities. And if we weren't so selfish and
Mm.
if we were more godly, then we would have listened to doctors and scientists.
Mm.
And I think that's still the attitude of that's the takeaway that many
Mm.
have taken. Conversely, as I said in that chapter as well, that there are a lot of people whose approach to ministry or whose theological views I have serious issues with in other domains, who are nevertheless very strident in keeping churches open and in taking what would be thought of as a balanced or sensible approach to keeping churches open and keeping people meeting together. And that makes me, as someone who, runs in these circles of scholarship in academia and in the church, makes me uncomfortable. And yet I find myself more aligned with those people. And so I think there was a sort of a, as I said, how willing are you to buck the trend or buck the secular elites in other areas?
Mm.
Maybe prepared some people for this kind of to think more clearly or more critically about what we were going through.
Yeah, and in some ways that's a really helpful thing, isn't it? That we can identify more clearly our desire to be respected, our desire to be loved by the culture. It's particularly, I'm sure you'd agree with me, in the academic world, it's a particular temptation because you want to look clever, you want to look sophisticated, and you want people to think of you as belonging to that class. So it's a very, very easy thing to do. And we did see it laid bare at that time. But what would you say, to people who would come back at you and say, well, be that as it may, we should have listened to the scientists, and we should have done what the governments were telling us to do. And why is there any issue at all in the first place? Why make an issue of it? Why not, join together in this heroic effort to resist the virus and to care about other people by taking our masks and, oh, sorry, wearing our masks and taking our vaccines and so on?
Hmm. Yeah, well, this is obviously a huge question, and what I tried to do in the book was, so I have, personally, dispositionally, very anti-authoritarian views,
Me too.
politically and theologically, and yet I recognize that many people would be open to the use of more force or maybe soft forms of coercion for the sake of the common good. And to be fair, Christians should be working in the world for the sake of the common good. And yet, what I wanted to demonstrate, especially in the sort of second portion of the book, is to show methodically, especially in domains that relate to how COVID was responded to in the church, all of the ways in which the authorities were wrong
Mm.
and the ways in which that the advice that they gave turned out to be wrong and was later reversed, was later shown to be not true. And I'm trying to be cautious about attributing motives to people and to people higher up, because I think irrespective of motives, there are many people further down the chain who have good motives, who were well-meaning, and most people who participated in these things that turned out not to work did believe that they worked and were well-meaning.
Mm.
And yet still we have to take stock and say that these things did not make a meaningful dent in the progress of the virus. And so that should help us, that should give us pause, right? Certainly if we don't look back and see what actually happened, then we're not going to, number one, know what to do next time, but number two, who to trust and how to approach these questions next time. And I think that, what was the second part of your question?
I think there was only one part, which was about why push back at all on any of this.
Oh
Why
yeah.
just
Okay.
why not just join with the heroic effort?
Right, right. Well, and I think that the part that I wanted to point out was that there was
Mm.
real damage to all this. These were not costless interventions.
Mm.
There was the cost in terms of divisiveness, but then the actual tangible costs of many of these um, public health interventions. Now, other books have emerged and are starting. There's a lot of research that's emerging now about the social consequences for education, for the global poor, for so many things, for people who are mentally ill or who are disabled in different ways, or victims of abuse, who struggle with addiction. And so I try not to replicate that research in my book, but refer to it and focus more on the damage in the church. I think that the damage in the church was such that we not fully, because many people who were alienated by not only the unreasonableness of many churches, but also the fact that they felt little support in the personal choices that they made. And the fact that they're now gone, or they've either sorted into other churches, or some have just left the church and have not come back, and may have even left Christian faith altogether, that they're sort of out of sight, out of mind for the people that have just stayed and maybe have moved on. But my point is that you can't move on without fully taking stock of what happened and the people that were hurt and alienated. And I was on a podcast with a friend recently who's done more work on like spiritual abuse in churches. And what he pointed out something very, very thoughtful, which was that it's not only bad for the people who've been alienated and who've departed the church because of the divisiveness of different interventions that were imposed, but it's also bad for the leaders and the people who made these errors and then got their way, because that's spiritually damaging. If I do something that's wrong or that's overbearing, if I am overbearing in a friendship, or as a pastor, I make I alienate someone and then I just go on with my life. I don't realize it, but I might not realize it immediately, but that takes its spiritual toll on me.
Mm.
And then it's going to subtly reinforce or prime me to respond in a coercive or a less sensitive manner in future pastoral leadership decisions or interactions. And so it's not only for the people who stayed and the people who left, but it's also for the leaders important for us to really reflect on what happened and what we got wrong. And also, I do think that, as I conclude in the book, that if we actually do run this sort of experiment of obedience, of forgiveness, of confession, of truth and reconciliation, for lack of a better term, that I think we could see spiritual revival. I think we could see people turning to the church, because that's not something that they're used to seeing in the culture. People don't often admit when they're wrong and seek reconciliation for the sake of relationship.
Mm.
It's easier just to, well, I alienated someone. Well, who cares? Or I may regret that, but we're just going to move on. But actually seeking out brothers and sisters that you've offended, or have offended you, and seeking to reconcile, that could be a tremendous testimony to the world about the reconciling power of the gospel.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. How do you, so one of the problems that we had at the time was that we were just being told, well, scientists are saying X, Y, and Z. We should just accept what the science says, as though science is some kind of sort of monolithic entity that everyone agrees about, who knows what they're talking about. But then on the other hand, even if you're sort of skeptical about that, what people would always say is, well, you're not qualified to speak about science. Who are you? They might say you're just a priest. You don't have any relevant qualifications. Now, in some ways, you don't actually have exactly the same problem, because you do have actual professional experience in the pharmaceutical industry. So you do have an area where you have specialized knowledge. But nevertheless, a lot of us just have this problem where, people will just say, you don't have the specialized knowledge. You're not in a position to adjudicate between scientific positions, especially when there's a strong scientific consensus. So who do you think you are to do X, Y, and Z? And actually, I mean, one of the things you say, one of your principal critiques of the church, is that spiritual leaders erred by pressurizing people into being vaccinated and so on and so forth. But the problem, one of the problems we have, is that there are sort of empirical assumptions that are being made when we make these kind of arguments. And as much as I don't agree with that argument, there is nevertheless a question here about how we adjudicate between different empirical positions when we are presented with situations like this. So how do you sort of get around that one?
Well, first, I want to clarify that you're kind to allude to my experience adjacent to a scientific field.
Mm.
I did work in the pharmaceutical industry in regulatory documentation
Mm.
for many years while I was in seminary and graduate school. And so I don't have any scientific training beyond a high school level, but I was kind of up close and got a front seat reading a lot of the documentation surrounding this drug research. And it did open my eyes to a lot of different um, things. In some ways, knowing people in that industry and still being friends with people in that industry, it makes the concerns even more troubling, because it's not as though I can demonize all these people and say they're terrible, evil people who are trying to push, poisons on us. I think many of them are really, really sincerely trying to find cures and drugs that make our lives better and keep us healthy. So if there's all these people with good intentions and things still went haywire, why are we even more in a bad situation? But I think what your question kind of gets at is what do we do with expertise, especially those of us like you and I don't have any formal scientific training. I think that where we see science, where we need as Christians and as Christian leaders to push back, is where we start to see science venturing into the areas of meaning and morality, right?
Mm.
So science as a method can give us very good provisional knowledge about the world and what will happen if I do this, and then this will happen. But what we've seen in modernity is that modernity as as an epoch, or as an era, we've seen the rise of scientism as an alternate religious worldview, in which science has been then given more importance and purports to be able to give us both meaning and morality. And so that is where I think, as Christian leaders, when we start to see moralizing on the part of science or scientific authorities, so to speak, those are not questions that scientists are fit to answer. And really, I would say, even as a Christian leader, I'm not necessarily fit to pronounce one way or the other on moral questions, other than what the scriptures have said clearly. I am supposed to preach and proclaim, and what all of us are supposed um, to believe and to live by. And so when we start to see whether it's governments or scientists moralize or use coercion, that is the sign, that is the indication that there's something that's amiss here. Because if we had a fantastic cure or a fantastic treatment or a way of losing weight or curing diabetes or heart disease or something, then the way to promote that is simply to convince people and say, hey, look, here's the evidence that it works. You can try this too. You should do it too. And then that's how things change. That's how we saw a reduction in, cigarette smoking, as people started to see the correlation. And try as we might, trying to ban it, trying to forbid it was very challenging. And still there are some people who know it's bad for them and still do it, right?
Yeah.
But at least they have better information now. And I think it's that use of manipulation and coercion, especially spiritual manipulation, that's a red flag, and that pastors should push back against. And I think another important piece of this that maybe many pastors are not, that I do have, again, not some special technical knowledge of, but have been following for a long time, is the rise of the online censorship. And so because so many of us get our research and our insights about, or our guidance on how to handle these things online, once you saw censorship and giant foot on the scale on these social media platforms and other tech platforms, that's what chapter 13 of the book is about, is that we should be very, very concerned. It doesn't mean that everything that is censored is correct. We have to make that be careful to avoid that mistake. But when we start to see censorship and coercion and not moral suasion, but guilt trips, right, and spiritual manipulation, that's when we should be very concerned, and our spiritual spidey sense, should be tingling.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because, I mean, in your book as well, and I was obviously aware of it at the time, you document a number of very high profile Christian leaders. I think they're mostly in the US, but I think you mentioned N.T. Wright as well, who's obviously British, who were very strong on saying that people ought to have the vaccine, that they should have the vaccine. I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think Justin Welby said that Jesus would have the vaccine. And in a sense, that's sort of cringing and horrible, and you think it's obviously wrong. But there is a sense in which you might say, well, in certain circumstances as a pastor, you might want to, I don't know what kind of context it would be in, the context of a pastoral conversation or, private pastoral conversation or something like that. When something like that, sort of a health issue might come up, and you might offer some advice as a sort of non-specialist from a pastoral perspective. But there's something a bit off when a church leader makes such a broad statement about what everyone ought to do in a particular situation, even though they know that people have different views on it. It's almost like you're moralizing a particular kind of view of vaccines or something like that. I mean, I find it hard to articulate exactly what I mean here, but there is something about it which seems manipulative and wrong, as you say. I think the other aspect of it, which pastors surely should bear in mind, pastors and church leaders, is like, what if you're wrong? If you're telling people if you're telling everyone in the world to take a vaccine and say millions of people do it partly because of what you say, like what if you're wrong? Like what if it's not 100% safe? What if it damages certain people? What if it's not effective and you're just getting people to open themselves to risk? So, I suppose that sort of critique in some ways it sort of cuts both ways, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, we're told, you must accept X, Y, and Z. But on the other hand, if you do accept it and then you start telling people and you turn out to be wrong because you didn't know what you were talking about, then you bear a certain weight of moral responsibility for what you've done in that circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I'd say two things in response. One, I take your point about in a private pastoral conversation, maybe you might, as a non-specialist, give someone advice like, let's say they're struggling with alcoholism and you want
Mm,
them to go get some treatment, or they're debating what, if they've got cancer, whether they should go with this kind of treatment or that kind of treatment. You don't have a specialist role to play, but what you can do as someone who cares about them and is their pastor, you can help them to clarify their priorities. If there are any moral issues with respect to the treatments, you can speak into those. I think that's a role for pastors to play.
mm, mm,
Cautiously, like, if something was produced in or the research was done in an unethical way, that's something for people to consider. Um, but then what we see if you talk to many doctors, and if you see it you can even see it in the placebo effect from research, is that
mm,
it's so important that a person who takes a treatment or undertakes a course of treatment, whether it's diet and exercise or a cancer drug or whatever, that they believe in it and they're committed to it. And so in some ways, even as a physician, when you read what physicians have done, they kind of good physicians will give people options for treatment and good objective information about the likelihood of these things being successful, but then let the patient choose. And the patient choosing and committing to a certain path is crucial to the success of the path. It's not going to be successful if the patient feels it's imposed upon them. And so that's where the pastor has to be very careful, even in our own, even in areas where we're shepherding someone's soul. It's so much better if we can
mm,
convince them that, or get them to realize for themselves what is the right path that they should take, right?
mm, mm,
Then when it comes to bigger, more public statements, I think what was concerning is that pastors took approaches that there were some that were ostensibly saying, "Oh, I'm not going to coerce anyone," or I'm not going to force anyone to do something, but I am going to promote this, right?"
mm,
And so, like you said, there's a danger in, well, what happens if it turns out that this intervention has side effects or that doesn't go as intended? Then you look like you've reduced your credibility, rightly so. But what I think it was also concerning was the lack of recognition. I don't want to use, I'm going to be careful how I word this, but not recognizing that all of the pressure was one direction in
mm,
society. So in the book, I talk about one Christian leader whom I respect very much for his other writings, but who said like, you have radical freedom, and with your freedom, I'm going to try to convince you to choose the vaccine. Now, okay, yes, okay, I'm good with freedom, but what that approach fails to recognize is that all of the pressure that people were facing in their society, in their churches, in their jobs, in the military, in their medical contexts was in one direction. And so actual freedom, actual um uh let's say a good kind of humility, a humble agnosticism about which is the right direction to go on the part of a pastor, or would be to insist that we not pressure people either way,
mm,
right? And so, and this is where when it comes to the segregation of churches that I brought up in I forget, chapter 15 or 16, that when Peter and when the Judaizers in the Galatian churches were trying to make people make the Gentiles Judaize or to separate from say, well, you can be your disgusting Gentile Christian self over here and eat your pork, but we Jewish Christians are going to eat over here. That it was actually the criticism that Paul directed was not just at the Judaizers, but also at the Christian leaders who were all Jewish, who could have eaten at either table and themselves didn't have a problem eating with Gentiles. But because they failed to insist in the churches that no one may insist on these adiaphora, kind of these amoral matters of eating pork or circumcision, that they actually failed in their moral pastoral responsibility. And so they should have spoken, not just let the Judaizers split off for themselves and think of themselves as superior, but they should have actually enforced not enforced, but to say this is wrong for you to insist. And so Christian leaders actually do, I think, have a role to play in insisting that no one may insist on matters that are not directly scriptural, right? So I think that's where we have to be more. That's where maybe we as Christian leaders fell down on the job, and need to reflect on that. And because it's not necessarily going to be COVID-28 or, the next, it's going to be another issue that comes in to potentially divide the church and or different churches in different contexts. And if we're not prepared to stand up and say, no, you must not insist on this thing that the scripture itself does not insist on, then we're going to let our sheep be abused and led around in different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. Benj, just one more sort of thing I wanted to ask you. In some ways, it was a complete catastrophe, what happened on every level. In other ways, it seems to have changed the world in a good way, insofar as it seemed to me at the time that there was a sort of opportunity for the gospel and for the faith, which didn't really sort of exist prior to COVID. Certainly in my country, the places I've lived in the last few years, like people are very wealthy and they've got lots of money, lots of material comfort. And it seemed to me to sort of open people up to questions of, ultimate meaning and ultimately to Christianity in many cases. And I think that we connected and we continue to connect with people like that via the podcast, but I also see it to a certain degree on the parish level here, both here and in my previous parish in Nottingham, a sort of an openness which I don't think was really there previously. Now we are hearing in Britain and in other places as well of sort of green shoots of recovery. There's been this well-publicized report in Britain called the Quiet Revival Report, which shows especially that young men are coming to church more frequently. And just anecdotally, I've heard lots of reports of churches being packed out over the Easter weekend in a way which is highly unusual. There have been reports in the press about this. And there are even some people who are making the link between the COVID situation and what's going on now. So I guess what I wanted to ask you really is, do you see things in that way that, largely this was a disaster, but it may be as in God's providence, given the church an opportunity for evangelization and getting the gospel out there? And what are your other thoughts about where the church is now as a result of the last 5 years and what you'd like to see? I realize it's quite a broad question, but take it in any direction you wish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's so much there. Obviously, I am overall hopeful, right? I think it was Leslie Newbegin who said, "I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead."
Right.
And yet, in different contexts, I think we can be either see signs of optimism or concern. I do think that this is a time where there is a lot of the old structures of authority and validation that people relied upon are crumbling. That's kind of an overall theme of the book as well, especially in chapter 16. But it doesn't mean that necessarily we have good alternatives yet built for things for institutions that people trust. And so I do think that there is an opportunity for especially local churches where there is faithful proclamation of the gospel and administration of the sacraments and slow, methodical discipleship and evangelism. That is the way of the future. It's not going to be mega churches or online churches. And I do think there is a reaction against some of those things amongst younger people who, my kids are 14 and 11, and we guard their online time, and they know what's happening in the online world, and they have dumb phones and they text their friends, but for the most part, they're very active in embodied activities, playing with their friends, playing sports, doing drama, things like that. And so I think that, and they both love being involved in church and church music. And so I think I'm very, very thankful for that. So I think there is hope. I think I know that this is a complicated issue politically, and that the issues are different in Europe versus in the United States. But I find myself, especially given my contact with the global church through missions, very, very hopeful about the growth of Christianity all over the world,
Mm.
especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, Southeast Asia, China. And I am serving in a very small, in my denomination, it's a break off from the mainline Presbyterian denomination. So a lot of people in many of our churches are white, European descent. And yet the churches that are growing very quickly are those that are incorporating immigrants, those that are multilingual. And so I think that the future of the church is, again, without making any comments about immigration policy or specific endeavors, but I think that as we see people who maybe come from other countries who have a sincere Christian faith, I always think of it as I have a lot that I can learn from this person who has come from a faraway place and come and living, especially for myself, having lived as a foreigner in a strange land, understanding what that feels like. And so churches that, but more broadly, churches that are able to incorporate people across boundaries of difference, that's really where the church is going to push back the forces of darkness, because I think you've read some Michael Heiser.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
read
Yeah. Yeah.
Heiser.
Yeah.
I knew Mike a little bit and
Oh, really?
interacted with him at
Cool.
conferences and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's very, very sad that he passed away so young. But I think he's right in that the spiritual forces around the world, that we see, we saw them on display when they were trying to get us to dehumanize one another, to divide us against one another, and to show contempt for the body, right?
Mm.
Going back to the Gnosticism issue,
Mm.
that I am treating a person across from me as a threat,
Mm.
to my health and well-being, rather than as a person made in the image of God who has a chance to reflect the image of God back at me. The spiritual forces love to see us dehumanizing and divided against one another. But what they hate to see is people worshiping as one, bound by belief in the gospel, and bound by one Holy Spirit. And especially I've seen this when we can worship across boundaries of language. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to worship in a multilingual context, but I think this is not the right thing for every church, obviously, but it's something so special when we can see ourselves united across these boundaries of race and language. And so wherever I see that happening, or what maybe it's class differences. Like here in Western Pennsylvania, we don't have a lot of ethnic diversity, but if you see a church where a fourth generation farmer and a remote worker and a college professor and someone who works in a retail store are all worshiping together and having great fellowship and discipling each other's kids, that's a place where the Spirit of God is at work. And so I am hopeful, and I do think that that the church can be well positioned if we can take stock of what happened during COVID, we can be well positioned to reap the fruits of those shoots that are springing up of once the authority structures are razed to the ground.
Mm,
Maybe more of a Rod Dreher. I'm a
mm,
big fan of Rod, but
mm,
the when those structures are leveled, if the church can be there as a haven and then ready to rise from among those ashes, uh, that's that's what we're called to do, and I do think that we can we can do that
mm.
By God's strength and the power of the Holy Spirit.
Great. That's a great note to end the conversation on, Benj. I mean, it's an encouraging and hopeful note. Thank you. I would just say that, I mean, I'll obviously I'll leave a link to for people who want to find your book, which is available now, House Divided: Technology, Worship, and Healing the Church After COVID. So that will be there. Is there anything else you want to point people to, Benj, to find you and your stuff?
Well, I'm not super active on social media. I am on Facebook and Twitter at Benjamin Giffone on Twitter,
Mm.
and you can find me on Facebook, but I don't spend a whole lot of time there. People are welcome to message me directly, and I do have a website where I put up my writings for the church and also link to my academic work. That is thinkhardthinkwell.com. And I am also so I really do hope people will look at the book and buy it and appreciate it, and then think about who they might be interested in sharing it with, because at LCI, the publisher, it's the Libertarian Christian Institute, libertarianchristians.com. They've been great and very supportive in promoting the book. This is the kind of book that from the beginning, when I floated it to some more mainstream Christian publishers in the United States, people took me aside and said, "There's no way we would publish something like this. So you don't even want to bother trying." Just, not trying to be offensive, but just like,
Yeah.
this is not going to be. And so this really is going to have to be a book that spreads by grassroots, on podcasts and on social media and things like that. So I would encourage you. I've really tried to write a book that's affordable and also something that you could give to people in your church who disagree with you or
Mm.
your pastor, and that he wouldn't necessarily feel attacked, but that it's something that they could reflect on and maybe be the starting point for a conversation. And it doesn't necessarily prescribe any one way forward, but it is hopefully sets the tone for understanding and reconciliation. So
Mm. Great.
yeah,
Well,
so
good on Liberty Christian Institute Press. I mean, good for them for publishing the book. That's fantastic. And,
yeah,
really, it's in some ways, it just shows, I think, the providential hand of God in this whole thing. You're right, on the face of it, people won't want to publish such a book because, for all sorts of reasons. But the fact that LCI Press did so, I think, is a fantastic thing. And I think you've done really, really well to work on this book and to put it together and to put it out there, even though you knew that it would be very difficult to get it published. So well done to them, and well done to you, Benj.
thank you. I'm also as a supported missionary. To be honest, there's a little bit of trepidation about
Yeah.
putting out a book like this.
Yeah.
When my like you, my my ability to feed my family depends on
Mm.
you know people giving money and people buying my books and supporting my writing. So,
Mm.
but I'm really thankful for all those who are encouraging along the way, including yourself, and just encourage people to trust that if they do the right. I've seen this over the last few years, that if they act in good conscience and do the right thing, as they believe God is guiding them, that God's going to provide for their needs. That's a whole nother podcast, a whole nother conversation, but I've seen so many ways that God has just provided for us
Mm.
over these years of being a missionary and now being a missionary again.
Fantastic. Well, amen to that. Brilliant. Okay, Benj. Well, we should leave it there. Really, really appreciate your time and all your hard work on the book. And good luck and God bless with everything. And hopefully see you again on the podcast at some point. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.